Oh, good evening. Continuing from my list of my top 10 favorite film directors of all time, today I'll be discussing none other than the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock is often praised by scholars, audience members, and critics alike for being the master of suspense. Born August of 1899 in London, England, Alfred Hitchcock managed to direct 54 completed feature films and hosted TV shows in a career spanning 54 years. Watching his early films as well as his later films, I find it really interesting how he managed to not only adapt different film styles, but also how he really utilized the visual aspects of the film medium. He passed away in April of 1980, and his films still managed to stand the test of time. Kicking off this list at number 10, Rear Window. Without a shadow of a doubt, Rear Window is one of Hitchcock's most celebrated masterpieces, praised by critics and audience members alike. It was also one of the handful of films from the master of suspense I was lucky enough to see on the big screen. Starring Grace Kelly and featuring frequent collaborator James Stewart, Rear Window might seem like a glamorous Hollywood picture, lacking any excessive sex or violence. It's not only shockingly bleak, but it's also pretty damn violent. With a simple enough premise, our protagonist is a veteran photographer who is wheelchair-bound in a New York City apartment 24/7 and kills the time peeping through his neighbors' windows and into their lives. It is one night, however, that stirs up the crucible and has him suspecting that one of his neighbors murdered his invalid wife and is scattering parts of a dismembered corpse all over town, while ignoring sexual advances with 25-year-old Grace Kelly because who the hell wants to be romantically involved with 25-year-old Grace Kelly? James Stewart enlists her to go sleuthing around the courtyard and even in the suspect's apartment. As I mentioned earlier, Rear Window is often considered a glamorous PG Hollywood picture from the 1950s, but it is incredibly dark, gruesome, sleazy, and disturbing with stellar performances. It's also pretty damned amusing seeing Perry Mason hiding from the authorities. At number 9, The Lodger, a story of the London fog. One reason why this film is so monumental in the director's prolific career is because it is considered by Hitchcock himself to be his very first true suspense film. This is another film from the director I got to see on the big screen. Not only was it the very first silent film I got to see in theaters, but it holds a record for being the longest I ever traveled to see a movie. Just to give a rough estimate, it was from South New Jersey to New York City. The Lodger is a silent film that draws heavily from the styles of German Expressionism and is heavily based on the unsolved case of Jack the Ripper. With an opening that still sends shivers down my spine to this day, we immediately witness a murder and learn that it is merely a statistic in a string of murders done by a notorious serial killer called the Avenger. During this ongoing investigation, a mysterious stranger in town takes shelter in a house that is renting out a room. The stranger is definitely the type of guy you would give a second glance at if you walked past him, and the fact that the young woman of the house is romantically involved with one of the detectives, the stranger starts to gain unwanted attention and soon becomes a lead suspect. Despite being the first true suspense film of the young director, it is definitely one of his best works and features many of his trademarks and tongue-in-cheek humor. It also has a Criterion release, and when I took my friend who does not care that much for movies to see it in New York City, he considers it an absolute favorite of his. At number 8, Rope. Much like Rear Window, Rope has James Stewart with top billing, and much like Frenzy, I was embarrassingly late to the party with this one. Rope is a technically daring film, especially for its time, as not only does the entire film take place in one single setting and plays out in real time, but the film is edited to appeal as one long seal take. Loosely based on the real-life murder case of Bobby Franks, which was committed by scholars Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, mirroring his first suspense film, Hitchcock wastes no time in getting to the good stuff. Immediately after the opening credits, the viewers are treated to a close-up shot of a brutal and violent murder being carried out, and the weapon of choice is, of course, a rope. The two lead characters are college students, and their victim is a fellow college student, and the two decide to immediately discard the body and hide out till the heat blows over. I'm just messing with you. The two Nietzsche-quoting intellects decide to hide the body in a trunk in plain sight and serve food on top of it. stay away from the sushi. They throw a dinner party and invite the victim's parents, girlfriend, and their college professor, played by James Stewart, in his first collaboration with Hitchcock. During the party, the two murderers decide to talk about how nice the weather is and their favorite sports teams. Again, I'm just messing with you. They talk about the societal benefits of murder, and essentially, if you have an IQ above 120, you deserve to fucking murder people. At least I know now that Walmart would be out of business if this became a law. Professor James Stewart finds the topic rather satirical and adds to the humor, but soon he too, along with the rest of the guests, becomes deeply concerned with the nihilistic American psychos and grows curious with their odd behavior. Once the party wraps up and all the guests leave, Stewart decides to come back and continue with his sleuthing. This film was banned in certain parts of America due to the heavily implied homosexual relationship between the two lead characters. This was the first Technicolor film of Hitchcock's career, which must have added to the technical nightmare of shooting long, single takes, because those Technicolor cameras were huge. It's certainly one of my absolute favorites of Hitchcock's career, because he really outdid himself with the camera work and still managed to tell an entire story through the visuals alone while breaking so many technical barriers. At number 7, North by Northwest. This is another film from the director I was lucky enough to see on the big screen. And although it wasn't my first time seeing it, it sure as hell felt like it, and every minute proved to be as immersive as the last. More proof that movie theaters will stick around. North by Northwest is one of Hitchcock's more tongue-in-cheek films, and although it revolves around murder and espionage, it's more of an adventure film, and that's not at all a bad thing. Starring Cary Grant in one of his 4 outings with the legendary filmmaker, he plays a New York City advertising executive who is framed for murder and finds himself a target for foreign spies, including James Mason and a young Martin Landau. Being forced to go on the run after being framed for a murder, Cary Grant falls in love with a mystery woman played by Eva Marie Saint, who was also in the movie Exodus. This movie features 2 of the director's most memorable scenes. The one where Cary Grant is chased around a cornfield by a crop duster with vengeance, and a chase on Mount Rushmore, which will give anybody anxiety. This film features a tremendous and fitting score by Bernard Herrmann and superb performances by some of the greatest actors of all time. And despite being more of an adventure story, it features some of the more intense nail-biting sequences in Hitchcock's filmography. Directed by a man who's known to have mastered the suspense genre, it goes to prove that not only is the man an ideal candidate to tell stories of adventure, but it's also a textbook example of how suspense goes hand in hand with action. Not only is the crop duster sequence one of my personal favorite action scenes in film history, but the truck explosion is certainly a scene every moviegoer needs to experience on the big screen. At number 6, Lifeboat. Based on a novella by John Steinbeck, this 1944 film is a shockingly grim exploration of 9 strangers who survived a cruise, torpedoed by Nazis. Each of the 9 strangers are complex characters from differing social classes, with complex backgrounds, and one of the 9 is a German-speaking Nazi. The film definitely reminded me of the even more disturbing true story of the whaling ship Essex, but no worries, no cannibalism is involved in this story. Although 8 of the 9 survivors are either American or British, the decision to cast the Nazi overboard is eventually dismissed, as he is the only crew member with exceptional navigation skills. Promising to lead the castaways to safe land, the German decides to take a different route, jeopardizing everyone on board. Not only that, but between the overwhelming heat, dehydration, hunger, and exhaustion, paranoia and madness begin to overwhelm the entire crew, leading to fights and impulse acts of frustration. Also, an amputation is carried out. Lifeboat is a movie that really caught me off guard and had me at the edge of my seat. With dreamlike cinematography and a single setting, the film is overwhelmingly bleak and intense, and not only are we unsure of what the hell will go wrong next, but we are left unsure of whether or not the survivors make it out alive. At number 5, Psycho. Based on the equally terrifying novel from Robert Bloch, which was based on the even more terrifying true serial killer Ed Gein, Psycho holds a very special place in my heart. Not only did I get to see it on the big screen, which I highly recommend you do if you ever get the chance, but it was also the very first Alfred Hitchcock movie I ever saw. Funny fact, I first watched it on TV at my grandparents' house by myself, and their staircase leads to the second floor is very similar to that at Norman Bates' house. So yeah, every time I would walk up those stairs, I'd be fucking waiting for Norman to jump out from behind the door and slice my face in half. This film broke so many barriers, and it's another reason why everybody needs to love Hitchcock. After making a plethora of Hollywood suspense films and fresh off of the adventure comedy North by Northwest with Cary Grant, and 1 year prior, the master of suspense gives us a grim and gritty story of a lonely man who murders women and preserves his mother's taxidermied corpse. The score is memorable and the cinematography adds layers to the terror. I remember sitting in a packed movie theater, and when the legendary shower scene came on, everyone went completely silent. With the enhanced audio, you could hear the water running through the pipes, which added to the intensity, and as for the grisly discovery of Norman's mother and the fruit cellar, that shit will never not be terrifying. Having read the novel, I very much like it how Hitchcock decided to replace the middle-aged man with the young boy next door, Anthony Perkins, as Perkins was the ideal fit. And though I do prefer the film to the book, you need to admit, it would have been pretty damn metal if Anthony Perkins did decide to decapitate Marion in the shower. At number 4, Saboteur. In what is perhaps Hitchcock's most underrated, yet intense thrillers, the film introduces the protagonist during his shift at the airplane factory, but jumps to his feet when a gargantuan fire breaks out and threatens to destroy the entire factory, as well as everyone in it. In what is an incredibly brutal and vicious scene, especially for 1942, we see our protagonist's best friend fall to his knees as he is engulfed by flames while trying to put them out with a fire extinguisher we later find out was filled with gasoline. Being framed for not only murdering his friend but also for starting the fire, our friend is hunted by police and goes on the run, which kicks off this intense thriller. He then comes to meet a blind man who has his daughter help him with his journey. Although a bit cheesy and patriotic on a Michael Bay level at parts during Act 1, things start to really pick up during Act 2 when the blue-collar worker realizes the true culprit was a foreign saboteur, but having this knowledge places both him and his lover in jeopardy. But not only that, we also quickly learn that there's an even bigger disaster planned. This movie is grossly underrated, and as a true Alfred Hitchcock fan, I can proudly say this film contains some of the best scenes in any of Hitchcock's movies, one in which a gun-wielding man is chased around in a movie theater while an audience laughs playfully as an even more violent film is projected onto the screen, and one where a man plummets to his death from the Statue of Liberty. This movie is absolutely amazing, and though definitely playful and tongue-in-cheek throughout, it does get quite intense to the point you fear for the lives of our protagonists when they are held at gunpoint. At number 3, Vertigo. I first watched Vertigo when I was 10 years old and rented a VHS copy from my local public library, and it was one of those films that changed my entire perception on the power of cinema. I also remember watching the VHS tape and wondering if I had the wrong tape because of that strange introduction with a close-up shot of the woman's eyes and lips. There's a lot to appreciate about this film. Most recently, I came to notice it can be seen as an antithesis to the noir genre. While noir films are great and indeed push the envelope with dark subject matter, you certainly wouldn't see a 50-year-old cop or detective getting it on with a young, beautiful woman in her early 20s nowadays. That is where this film takes a sharp turn and almost lampoons the idea of having 50-year-old James Stewart tasked with investigating a young Kim Novak who is probably possessed by a ghost. After the woman he is chasing commits suicide, the veteran detective, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, decides to strike up a romantic relationship with an exact look-alike and begins to transform her into his dead lover. This is another film from this list that I got to see in theaters, and let me tell you, seeing the opening credits in a dark theater with a giant screen and surround sound was a total game changer. Not to mention, even though I was a huge fan of James Stewart by the time I first saw this movie, I watched it before I saw It's a Wonderful Life, and seeing the even-tempered, kind, and awkward James Stewart violently scream at and even throw Kim Novak was quite the shock. At number 2, Notorious. After her Nazi father is convicted for war crimes by the US government, Alicia Huberman, played by Ingrid Bergman, is wooed by United States government agent T.R. Devlin, played by Cary Grant, and is put on a mission to spy on her father's Nazi friends who are operating outside of Rio de Janeiro. During this operation, one of the Nazis falls in love with Alicia, Alex Sebastian, played by Claude Rains. Although against Devlin's wishes, the government agents persuade Alicia to marry Alex in hopes of obtaining a stronger, more intimate level of trust between the two. After discovering her new husband has a key to a rather large wine cellar, Devlin convinces Alicia to throw a party so the two can run off and come across a particular bottle filled with not wine, but a mineral which turns out to be uranium. Soon Alex and his mother start to grow curious about Alicia's true intentions and decide to start doing something about it. Notorious is a damn good classic filled with romance, suspense, and espionage. The best part though, you've got Cary Grant, Ingrid Bergman, and Claude Rains. For an honorable mention, I would like to bring up another underrated Hitchcock film, Topaz. Based on the novel by Leon Uris and starring John Forsythe, this movie, reminiscent of the hit 60s show It Takes a Thief, seems to miss the mark, so much so that Leon Uris, who was frustrated with Hitchcock's vision, left the film altogether. That being said, there are quite a few elements in the film that I really appreciate. For example, the scene where Philippe Dubois invites Louis Oribe to a hotel to discuss the contents of a briefcase. We see a POV shot from across a busy street, and we don't hear any of the dialogue except for the ambience of the busy street. Instead, all we see are the lips of the two men moving. That, and when I first saw it, I honestly found it to be rather intense, particularly with the topic of voyeurism and when a couple is taken prisoner and interrogated. The film was certainly overwhelming for me at the time and stuck with me years later. Not to mention it features a kick-ass score from one of my favorite film composers, Maurice Jarre. At number 1, Frenzy. Frenzy is simply a must-see for any Hitchcock fan or any overall film fanatic, and I am honestly shocked that not many people have seen it. Even hardcore fans of the Master of Suspense seem to overlook it, which makes very little sense to me. Though many consider The Birds or Marnie to be Hitchcock's last true masterpiece, it's probably because they haven't seen it. Although I personally tend to overlook the director's movies made after The Birds, with the exception of Topaz, Frenzy is perhaps the director's darkest and most degrading film. For one thing, it's the only film he ever made in which you get to see fully nude women in a very long and uncomfortable rape scene. But aside from that, even our protagonist is a very shady character. The main character, Dick Blaney, played marvelously by John French, is an ex-British military pilot who was left practically penniless and an alcoholic. As a matter of fact, the first moment we meet him, he is fired on the spot by his boss for stealing hard liquor from their stock. Besides his girlfriend, he has one friend, and that is Bob Rusk, a produce merchant in the heart of Covent Garden. All over London, there has been an ongoing string of murders targeting women who have been raped and then strangled to death with a necktie. So yeah, this movie is pretty damn graphic and brutal, and Hitchcock, who always enjoyed pushing the envelope, took great advantage with the R rating. I would like to shine a light on why this film stands out from the man's later works. When I first watched the movie, I was well aware of how grisly it was, but was instantly caught off guard by the music for the opening credits. That's because this was Alfred Hitchcock's first British film in decades, so aside from telling a violent and compelling narrative, he also wanted to shine the spotlight on his birthplace. Though it is based on a novel, it is no secret that Covent Garden plays a major role in the film, at least partly because Hitchcock spent much of his youth working with his dad selling produce in Covent Garden. And back to what else I love about this film personally, is oddly enough, it's simply one of those movies that really comforts me. Rape and misogyny aside, the color palette, the music, and the way it takes you through 1970s London just really does it for me. Also, it contains my personal favorite tracking shot in all of motion picture history. That, and I love the potato truck scene. Thank you for watching this. Please like and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments what your favorite Hitchcock movie is. Peace out.